called her.
talking against it, Angie.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talking against
Can
everything.
everyone turn their phones off of the Wi-Fi?
Mine's not.
Oh, okay.
You can put your
Actually,
airplane
mine is
mode
on.
Yeah, mine's off case.
Okay.
Just turn it off.
The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? lit.
Giving go my soul.
Real, live, lit. Right? The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is David Lance, Director of the National Office of Recruitment and Membership for the African People's Socialist Party USA, and I'll be your MC this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share this stream, invite your friends and family to it, so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion. Today we are going to be talking about the question of the nation, specifically the African nation, in a period where the thinking representatives of the white ruling class are trying to define this concept for us. It is critical for us as Black people, wherever it is that we've been dispersed around the planet, to recognize that we are one Africa, one nation. If we do not claim the African national identity, we fall victim to the hundreds of years of imperialist imposed identities that has kept us separated and our struggle divided. We will be reading from the book, One Africa, One Nation, pages 75 through 94, on the section titled, African Identity is Key, African Internationalism and the National Question on the Conference to Build the African Socialist International in 2005. As made evident in that title alone, the African People's Socialist Party, since its founding, has struggled to answer the fundamental question of the nation. It is a conclusion that we've long since come to quote Chairman, we were Africans when we got on the ship in Africa, and we were Africans when we got off the ship in Jamestown, Virginia, or the sugar plantations in the Caribbean. As part of this discussion, joining with us all the way from London, UK, is Secretary General of the African Socialist International, Luwezi Kinshasa, who has traveled through Europe and Africa, organizing Africans everywhere to the understanding that we are one people and that we must fight for a united socialist Africa. I am deeply honored now to introduce my leadership, the brilliant theoretician behind African internationalism, the theory that is uniting African people everywhere we are, the leader of the African nation, Chairman Omali Yeshitela.
Uhuru, brothers and sisters and comrades, I want to thank everybody for coming on to today's study. As it has been mentioned, we'll have with us on today's study Comrade Luwezi Kinshasa. Luwezi Kinshasa is a Congo-born African, right now living in London, England, and he is the Secretary General of the African Socialist International, which is the primary organization that all African people's socialist parties in every place on the planet are a part of. Together, we constitute the African Socialist International. And Comrade Luwezi and I have not had an opportunity to discuss how this thing is going to be done on this morning, but I thought it was extremely important for Luwezi Kinshasa to be a part of this discussion, not only because he is a very brilliant person himself, truly an African working class intellectual to the highest degree, but also because of where he was born and his experiences with Africans and Africa and where he's located. He brings a really important kind of perception to this discussion that I think is going to be important. And I think as an African internationalist, it contributes to a recognition that we are one African people, and we have the ability from different places in the world to look at Africa and our conditions and make predictions about our future based on that reality when we use a scientific approach for investigation and analysis that's often called dialectical and historical materialism. In the coming weeks, we will be discussing dialectical materialism. We will continue this discussion on matters revolving around theory, philosophy, because it has, for the longest period of time, being something that been a weakness of our movement, of the African liberation movement, wherever we've been located in the world. That's been one of the serious struggles, one of the serious complications for our movement. For the longest period of time, it is a movement that has not been informed by theory. On today, we're beginning the discussion around the nation, not just the African nation, but the nation. We need to grapple with this issue at a time where there is tremendous amount of uneasiness and uncertainty throughout the world around the question of the nation. Recently, we were having a discussion with some people, and someone made the statement that someone who we are familiar with was contacting us from Czechoslovakia. But the reality is there is no Czechoslovakia today. There is what they call the Czech Republic. And the point to be made here is that what we characterize as nations, we see a tremendous amount of flux. And on my way to this discussion I'm having, I was listening to a radio, and there was a discussion about what is characterized as Brexit anxiety in England, where many people in England, English persons, apparently are experiencing serious anxiety to the extent that they're needing mental health treatment because of the exit of England, or Britain as they call it, from the European Union. The point that I would make is Brexit is real. There's a huge struggle that's happening in Spain, where a sector of what has been characterized as Spain is fighting to disengage in the Catalan separatist movement in Spain. In various places throughout Europe, there's a whole movement of white people in Europe to split from what is characterized as the European Union. In fact, the greatest development, growth in the European Parliament that has been established has come from people who have been elected from the different countries to represent them in the Parliament, because they are opposed to the European Union and because they would serve to break it up. So this whole question of nation and national identity and what have you is something that's roiling the political world today. And those of us who are conscious of our reality as a people are aware that what is referred to as nations in Africa is a consequence of white people, Europeans in Berlin, Germany, in 1884 and 85, at the height of what the Europeans were characterizing as an era of nation building, as part of the process of building, if you will, the European nation. They were splitting up Africa and to make sure that there was no real African consolidation. Of course, their intent was not so much to make sure there was no African consolidation as much as it was to prevent war among each other and to be able to steal the resources of Africa without having intra-European conflict in the process of doing that. Because as you know, most wars have been revolved around struggles within what we now know as Europe to claim resources and loots in various places around the world, and they fought over that. So this issue of nationality is a serious issue. And the fact that it has surfaced in the European world and even in Africa at this moment is a statement of the crisis of a social system that came into existence. The whole capitalist system came into existence with the consolidation of what we call the nations and an assault on the unity of African people and other peoples around the world. And now there's a lot of discussion around this question, and it's really important for us as African people, and it's important for other peoples around the world. We want to have this discussion not because we like engaging in some kind of abstract banter, but because there are practical consequences for us in terms of how we understand this question. For example, right now in Africa, there are hundreds of Africans born in the United States who are wearing military uniforms from the United States government who are killing African people. Because these Africans in the United States are consider themselves to be some kind of African American or Afro American or just Black Americans or something to that effect, and are not conscious of, are not ready to recognize that we are simply Africans killing Africans. And when the English, the British were fighting the people on the continent of Africa who gave rise to the slogan Demand Uhuru, the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, known as Mau Mau, the British were able to use African people who were colonized in Africa to fight against Africans in Kenya who were resisting and in fact who had disrupted the British Empire for a number of years. The empire upon which the sun never set almost saw its demise in the fight against the Kenyan Land Freedom Army, or the Mau Mau, in the 1950s. And so England deployed Africans from the continent of Africa in some kind of Royal African Rifles to fight against the Africans in Kenya. In fact, one of the heroes of many Pan-Africanists, Idi Amin from Uganda, was one of those who fought. And then another Pan-Africanist, Museveni, his father was a part of the 7th Army Rifle who fought for the British. And in fact, the name Museveni, or many people say Museveni, comes from that. Museveni, of the seventh, from the 7th Army, some characterization like that from England. And so there's a tremendous amount of confusion, creates problems for us, serious problems for us. Africans killing each other on the continent of Africa because one is from one ethnic group as opposed to another ethnic group. Or we're fighting for the United States from Kenya and from Ethiopia against Africans in Somalia to further the interests of a hostile foreign entity that's responsible for enslaving Africans with that form of colonialism that was peculiar to those of us who were pushed out of Africa. These are the reasons. These are some of the reasons this question is really important for us. And so here we are, black Brits, Afro-Americans, Afro-Colombians in South America, Afro-French, Afro-Swedes, and all of these characterizations locked firmly, more or less, to an identity with white groups who themselves are struggling around what their identity may be, and which is a statement of just the folly that of this identification with the colonizer is. And so we want to grapple with this question not as some kind of empty, abstract event, but because the practical implications, and that now, more than any time, science is extraordinarily important to the African revolution, especially at a time of crisis like this that not only creates havoc for our imperialist enemies, but it also has bringing more Africans into our camp, trying to join our party, join our movement, etc. And at a time such as this, ideological clarity is more significant than any other period. So we want to talk about that, and I want to give a kind of an example of a basis for this discussion. This is a journal called Foreign Affairs. It is published by a group that's close to the Rockefeller interests. Rockefellers created something that they called the Trilateral Commission many years ago. And it was something that connected capitalists from Japan, Europe, and the United States. It's one of the basis of it being characterized as trilateral. In many ways, it was representative, one of the representations of the Atlanticist group, the group around which the interest of capital globally was concentrated, and that established the strategic trajectory of imperialist white power that established the United Nations, NATO, the existing trade relationships that's under assault now by Trump and the group associated with Trump, who are looking for, as Trump would say, a better deal. And it is extremely important for us to look at this. And this is the March-April 2019 edition. It comes out quarterly, if I'm not mistaken. And the cover article is around the new nationalism. And they have various articles written by forces talking about nationalism. nationalism is a concept that most of the Africans don't talk about except in some kind of abstract way that's not grounded or tethered to any scientific explanation of what the hell we mean. We are the black national, the African national liberation movement, or the black liberation movement, or national liberation struggle is what we're involved in. But what is the nation that we are talking about? There's very little understanding of that. There's very little real discussion about that, except we black, you know, which is important aspect of what we talk about when we talk about national identity of African people, but it's not good enough. So this is just quickly, we open up, I just want to say something about even the introduction that I think is really important. I'm just going to read a paragraph or two from the introduction, The New Nationalism. It reads, "The nation state is so dominant today that it seems natural. But no political arrangements are natural. No political arrangements are natural." That is to say, they didn't come because of some kind of genetic or some other kind of natural consequence. It says that no political arrangements are natural, and any concept with a hyphen has a fault line running through it by definition. And when they talk about a hyphen now, they're talking about the nation state. That's a hyphenated entity. But we would agree with this concept of the hyphenated entity, like the African American or the black Brit or all these other characterizations. There is a fault line running straight through it. States are sovereign political structures. This is the author. States are sovereign political structures. Nations are unified social groups. That's a generally true concept. States are sovereign political structures. Nations are unified social groups. What does each owe the other? So this is the nation state. He's saying there's nothing natural about it, and there's this fault line that guarantees that they rest upon, that makes it a shaky entity. The claims of the state are obvious. It has a host of practical responsibilities and legions of technocrats working to satisfy them. But the claims of the nation are less clear, and they come with ugly echoes. The advocacy of those claims, nationalism, drove some of the greatest crimes in history. And you know, the greatest crimes in history were created in the process of developing what we in the African People's Socialist Party recognize as the European nation. But for them, history begins with the emergence of white power, with the emergence of capitalism, with the emergence of what we would consider to be the European nation. For them, that's the beginning of history. And so they say that the advocacy of those claims, nationalism, drove some of the greatest crimes in history. And so the concept became taboo in polite society in hopes that it might become taboo in practice as well. Yet now it has come back with a vengeance. And so then they are talking about the different writers who are going to be expounding on the question of the nation and nationalism. That's an interesting introduction for me, anyway. Inside, there's an article characterized a new Americanism with the subhead, Why a Nation Needs a National Story. It's interesting. We're dealing with the theory now of the nation, not just the existing entity that might be characterized a nation by any group, the theory of a nation. And so this writer, her name is Jill Lepore, writes in the New Americanism, Why a Nation Needs a National Story. This is one of the things that combines this entity, gives it a sense of sameness, and gives it a political line, if you will, to explain the sense of sameness that all of us should experience. Like, what's the thing about something bursting in, whatever it's, what is it? How's that go? Bombs bursting in what? In the air, etc. I mean, all of us, all of them, you know, like have this real quickening heartbeat and a breathless moment when singing about this and visualizing bombs bursting in air and what have you. It's a part of the process of creating the national story. It's in song. It's in, you know, all kinds of things. This is consolidating a sense of sameness that's based on a real material reality. But this is the ideological explanation, the ideological manifestation of that. If you a popular ideological manifestation by people who will never read any of this that we are talking about. In fact, the value here of these are almost secrets. What I'm reading now, and it may not appear to be a secret because I bought this in a bookstore, but ordinary Africans and ordinary people do not read this. This is written for the bourgeoisie to help the bourgeoisie understand how to approach different questions. And you've got different authors who are writing for this because usually they end up, or they are vying to become part of the next administration and what have you, and they want their views accepted as the views that would dominate the world. And not just in America, but the Trilateral Commission. So we're talking about forces who were connected to Europe, to Japan, and to the United States. And there are other journals. This is just one, by the way, and I think it's probably one of the most significant of them. So all of this, by the way, is simply an overview to the discussion that we're going to be entering. But I just want to lay a certain kind of foundation because people talk about, again, the nation with no idea really tethered to some kind of scientific approach to investigation and analysis. So I want to start this. It's simple, you know. One wouldn't think that you know, somebody who's dealing with science would write in this fashion, but it has happened. And I think this is part of also the creating the warm and fuzzy feelings about the nation too, even the way this is written in some degree. For example, in 1986, the Pulitzer Prize winning bow tie wearing Stanford historian, now that helps us a hell of a lot, doesn't it? Bow tie wearing Stanford historian Carl Degler delivered something other than the usual pipe smoking, scotch on the rocks after dinner disquisition that has plagued the evening program of the annual meeting of the American Historical Association for nearly all of its century-long history, right? So, wow. Instead, Degler, a gentle and quietly heroic man, accused his colleagues of nothing short of dereliction of duty. Appalled by nationalism, they had abandoned the study of the nation. And you will hear liberals today who talk about nationalism being horrible because it's been responsible for all these wars that's happened. Nationalism is the basis for that, which you and I understand to be crazy, because nationalism was the reflection of the interest of the forces who fought these damn wars under these banners and flags and what have you of different aspects of capital, right? You with me on that? And so, yes, you can call it nationalism if you want to, but what they were fighting for was capital. Capitalism that expressed itself, and that because capitalism came from this, what they call the democratic revolution, that replaced serfdom in Europe and presupposed the willing ability of people to participate, just like the economy is now open up and people, the European peasants and serfs are not tied and stuck on the land. Now they have to have freedom to go out and sell their labor power, right, in a capitalist association. This presupposes certain kinds of democratic ability for mobility and other kinds of things. So now, as opposed to the lords and nobility pushing people against their will to go out and fight wars for them, people fight wars for them to defend the flag and the nation, not understanding that patriotism, all patriotism, is simply loyalty, fidelity to the bourgeois state. That's all it is. Anyway, so this gentle and quietly heroic man, Degler, has really said, you guys are not doing your job. This is the historians that he's talking about. And quote, why we can write history that implicitly denies or ignores the nation state, but it would be a history that flew in the face of what people who live in a nation state require and demand. So we can get rid of, we can do a history that denies or ignores the nation state. This is what he's saying, but it would be a history that flew in the face of what people who live in a nation state require and demand. And this was a night in Chicago that he said this, and that's helpful for us to understand this quiet, bow tie wearing, heroic man who was doing this stuff, which is also a description of what the nation is supposed to be about. In fact, quiet, bow tie wearing, heroic white guys, etc. But that's not how we've experienced the white nation at all, or the European nation. So I'm going to drop down to this, and I'm going to leave this alone, but the writer here says, nation states, when they form, imagine a past. Nation states, when they form, imagine a past. That, at least in part, accounts for why modern historical writing arose with the nation state. He's saying modern historical writing rose with the nation state. For more than a century, the nation state was the central object of historical inquiry. From George Bancroft in the 1830s through, say, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. or Richard Hofstadter, studying American history. Studying American history meant studying the American nation. Okay, I just wanted to go through this. This is just an example, and there are several other articles here. And all of these articles, we'll talk more about this in the coming weeks, but all of the articles here revolve around different interpretations of the significance of the nation, what it should look like, that kind of thing. They've even got an article that relies on much on quotes from people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass, people who are just trying to escape from colonial slavery in the United States and the consequences, the immediate consequence of colonial slavery, who are defining what, from their perspective, the nation should look like, because they're trying to enter this white thing here, and obviously they can't enter this white thing the way it acts and looks right now. So they're trying to force their way in, and they have this idealistic worldview, this idealistic position and point of view of what the nation is, right? And this is an argument they're making for entry. This is an argument they make for survival with this group. This is an argument they're making that's opposed to a huge sector of the population in this country who are also defining what their perspective of the nation is by lynching black people and killing the indigenous people and all this other kind of stuff. The national question is really important for us to understand. So I want to move this forward, and I'm looking for the formula. By the next meeting, and I think we'll be doing this question of the nation for the next 2 or 3 weeks. And then following this question, this discussion, I want us to do something on dialectical materialism, which I think is extraordinarily important for us to be dealing with as well. And my objective here is to arm you, because we engage in a critical struggle, and what is clear to me almost every day is more and more African internationalism is the go-to philosophy, and African internationalists are the go-to forces to try and explain this world, from whom analysis is required for an explanation of this world and prediction of the future. And it's important for us to be well equipped because I was telling you about this book, Foreign Affairs. They write this stuff, and it's a secret, even though it's in plain view for anybody who goes to a bookstore. It's a secret because nobody's going to read it except those who are really from the bourgeoisie, or trying to be in the bourgeoisie, trying to understand. These not ordinary people. But for us, the philosophy has to be rooted in the African working class and the working class in general, because it equips us, helps us to make a prediction. It helps us to explain our reality and make a prediction of the future. It is the philosophy of the working class. African internationalism is a philosophy of practice. It's a theory of practice. We are practical revolutionaries, and we recognize that the root of the future of humanity rests in the hands of the African working class and the workers of the world. And so this is where we spend this time that we do every Sunday here, having these discussions, and we'll continue having these discussions. We're going to be dealing just for, probably a little more intensely with theoretical questions moving forward for the next several weeks. And so I'm going to, this is something that we are studying on today. It's African identity is key. And it comes from the One Africa, One Nation book that was authored by me. It's a series of articles and presentations. And this that we're reading today is from a presentation that I made at the conference to build the African Socialist International, one of them that was held in 2005 in London, England. Comrade Louise Kinshasa was there as well. And the title is African Identity is Key, African Internationalism and the National Question, from the Conference to Build the African Socialist International 2005. And this is a struggle we've been involved in for a long time, and we have, from my point of view, all practical purposes, consolidated the leadership of the African Socialist International, and we exist in the Caribbean and in the United States and throughout Europe and in South Africa. We are growing in Nigeria, where I'm going to be soon, and Kenya and Sierra Leone and various other places around the world. So Comrade Louise, as I said, was there, and this would work better if everyone in this discussion would have read this presentation by now. I know that's not the case, but it would work better. But what I want to do now is, without going into a long reading, and the overview was long enough, I thought we were to have speakers established with this phone here where Louise is. Is there a speaker connected to this? Okay. So Comrade, yeah, it surely is. Yeah, thank you. Comrade Louise, I just wanted to open it up for comments and observation that you have, and you can use, if you want, the African identity is key as a reference point, or you can speak to what's already been said, and I want you to bring in your perspective to this question of the African, and we're going to be talking about this. Remember, I think it's important for this document to be central to the study. Because we're going to, in the next couple of weeks, go to the political report to the 6th Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, and where we did a long piece on the national question. And we'll be studying that for 2 or 3 weeks, so we don't have to try to accomplish everything in this setting, but I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Comrade Louise. Welcome to this discussion, and we all await with bated breath to hear your observations. Uhuru.
Well, Chairman, thank you for giving me the privilege to participate in these studies. And indeed, remember in 2005, when you actively introduced the question of the nation, and and 14 years later, it's just like an amazing development. And I just want to recognize your profound leadership because this question of the nation, nowhere in African world, even outside African world, it was not discussed as it's being discussed today. But that's about opening up. So we can look at the Stalin definitions of the nation, so that we can solve the fundamental question of African revolution. And you're right. When you say the question of the nation is the fundamental question, and you can see Africans everywhere are caught up in the definition of the identity imposed on us. Any African, you can ask them, "Who are you?" They're more likely to say something like they are Nigerians or they are black Brits. If they say black, maybe they're going to tell you the parents came from maybe Jamaica. Everywhere you go, you will not see, it's rare for Africans to say on a mass level, who are you? To say, I'm an African. So people always start from the identity imposed on us, and this is understandable. The black revolution has been crushed a long time ago, and all these questions are supposed to be resolved for us by the Black Power movement in the 60s was no longer there. So it's only African People's Socialist Party and your leadership that has taken up these questions. So what I would like to say is that as you said earlier on, nations are not natural formation, are not natural creation. They are social arrangement. They are something that has been developed through an historical process. And when you look at the European nations, it's quite clear, according to our philosophy of African internationalism, and this can be proven to everybody, that the European nation was born out of enslavement and colonization, and it continues to survive because imperialism has not been eradicated from the planet. Anything of significance in Europe, from what they call enlightenment, you're looking at colonization, genocide, democracy, you're looking at colonization, genocide, Renaissance, industrialization of Europe, free trade, everything of significance that Europe brags about has come as a result of enslavement and colonization of Africans and the vast majority of non-white people of the planet. And Africans, when we have to talk about the question of nationality, question of identity, if you go on the continent of Africa, you will see people, they will say they are Ghanaians, but they're quick also to tell you they are Akans, or if they're Nigeria, they're Yoruba, in South Africa, they're Zulu, they're quick to tell you that. And this shows clearly that there is the question of nation is a question that has not been clarified, and it makes sense because the African nation has not been consolidated, and we understand why. When someone says they are Zulu or Chokwe, all these identities, although historical identity is true, the language they speak is Zulu, they come from a group called Zulu, but these are arrangements before imperialist aggression of Africa. But we are saying that for African nation to be consolidated, we have to overthrow imperialism. And if someone's starting point is the tribe they came from, or the ethnicity that they came from outside of imperialism, they will not understand why we need to overthrow imperialism, why we need to build the African nation. So the starting point is the recognition, regardless of where black people are, in Africa or in Europe or in the Caribbean, wherever we are, the starting point is to recognize that the assault on Africa that began on 1415 has to be dealt with, has to be recognized, has to be, when the chairman talks about overturning the verdict of imperialism, that's what we're talking about. The assault that began in 1415, that continues today, that has created everything we talk about, industrialization, United States, Canada, all these, has to be recognized. This is the starting point, because most Africans, they believe, particularly in the continent of Africa, that Europe has been always Europe. The United States has always been there. Canada has always been there. Brazil has always been there. And people see in that fashion as opposed to something that is a creation of an assault on Africa and the vast majority of our colonized people. And that assault continues up to date. In Brazil, they're killing indigenous people in the forests of Amazon. All these wars in Africa are wars to maintain these arrangements they call today's nations. And it's a new phenomenon. When Europeans assaulted Africa, they were not talking of a nation. When all the Diego Cao, the Columbus, all these imperialist agents, when they attacked the rest of the world, they were not debating about the nation. So the nation is something new. And so Africans, we need basically to recognize that. And when this is recognized, then it will make it easier. Because we're talking of having one destiny, one solution. There can't be two solutions, because the starting point is the imperialist assault on Africa and the black people up to now. So we've been oppressed as a people, not as an ethnicity, as a tribe, as a region. Is the entire nation of black people being oppressed. So it makes sense that we begin to understand the commonality of that assault. So when we say Africans, the African identity is key, we mean basically our sense of sameness must flow from the beginning to now. So what happens to Africans in Africa? What happens to Africa in the United States? What happens to Africans in the Caribbean? And elsewhere Africans have been dispersed is our experience, is our history, is our sense of sameness. We have to internalize that, because there is no way for us to be in the process to win our struggle basically for national liberation as a fragmented consciousness, as a fragmented nations. It will not work. The only way it can work is to have a unified consciousness, a unified struggle, a unified nation, a unified philosophy. And that's why African internationalism is so critical, because it's the glue that cuts through the fragmentation of black people. You know, I have here in Europe, basically in Britain, you all know about Brexit. I have one priest here. His name is Tim Thornton. He's complaining, and he say basically the glue that used to be there is no longer there in many instances. So he's talking about the fragmentation, the chaos he sees in Britain, and he recognized the decline of Britain. Basically, the ability of Britain to oppress and loot and kill around the world has been tempered, has been reduced, and therefore this causes chaos in Britain. So he recognized that, and he's a representative of the white ruling class, a priest somewhere in the UK here. So just to emphasize the necessity of us to fight, to engage in the struggle as a unified group, basically as a unified African nation, because there is a relationship between the rise of the African nation through revolutionary struggles and the decline of a European nation, as a bourgeois nation, as a nation born out of conquest, wars and killings and genocide and things like that. And that's the way forward for the emancipation of humanity. The European nation, born at the expense of everybody else who is not a colonizer, has to go, has to disappear. And this is the basically the mission of the African nation. And this is the mission, of course, driven by the African Socialist International and the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And this is basically the way forward is basically to consolidate the unification of an African national liberation struggle, which is really a driving bar of the discussion the chairman just introduced. You heard all these comments coming from various bourgeois intellectuals, but at the core of that is basically, although they don't point out to that, but at the core of it is that the African working class now is coming to the fore, is coming to the terms that the African petit bourgeoisie cannot drive the struggle for a unified African nation. It cannot do that because they sit on the same pedestal, just as the white nation with their white bourgeoisie and the white working class sits on. As parasitic social forces whose wealth depends on Africa being fragmented, whose prestige, careers, everything depends on Africa being split, divided, as Africa is today. So the only social force who can change reality, who can change the situation, who can unify the African nation is the African working class. That's why even the starting point cannot be what ethnicity you belong to, because the reality is, if we're going to achieve power, you cannot achieve power as an ethnic group, as a tribal group. It does not make sense, because the tribalism, is a defense of a status quo, defense of imperialism. It's basically an alliance of imperialism, because you don't recognize imperialism as the enemy, as the threat. You recognize the enemy being somebody from other groups who suffer just like you, who's under colonial domination just like you, and as the enemy, and you prepare to go to war and kill them, when in reality the enemy is imperialism. And that's something we need to come to terms with. Everyone who is involved in the struggle to change the world, to change, basically to build the African nation, has to be loyal to Black Power. Black Power has to be what defines loyalty of everybody. If you're going to commit, if you are African petit bourgeois and you're going to commit class suicide, you have to be loyal to Black Power, because the bourgeoisie has an international power. The bourgeois power is an international power. And you cannot fight international power with your tribal power or with your Berlin Conference defined borders. You cannot fight imperialism like that, because imperialism power is an international power. The power of the United States and France and all these powers are beyond their reach, beyond the shores. So we're dealing with an international phenomenon. So the question of African nation is an international phenomenon, because Africans are dispersed around the world. And one point of confusion, which we have to completely, definitely eliminate it, is the difference between Africans who are in Americas and Africans who are in Africa. It's not common. If you are in Africa, you hear somebody referring to your Africans coming to United States as Black American, something like that. And we have to really actively fight for a unified nationality, a unified consciousness. Africans in the United States, Canada, and Brazil, they are Africans and they are victims of colonial domination before industrialization. Africans have, continents have to be clear about that because the power for Europe from Berlin Conference has been industrialization. People struggle in Africa to explain why Europe is so powerful. Where they get this technology from? All this stuff, enlightenment we talked about from France, democracy from Europe when Europe was a place of tyranny. All these are results of what Karl Marx referred to as primitive accumulation, the killing, the brutality, colonization, the murder of Africans in the Americas. That is what created industrialization of Europe, the United States, and so on. So Africans in Americas are Africans, just like Africans on the continent, and Africans have to, on the continent, have to unite colonization in Africa and colonization outside Africa of black people as one process. It's not two process. It's just one process, but with different phases, and that's really really critical. So that we can begin to move forward. And I want us to end up with the question of African nation. Why Nkrumah was right, why Garvey was right. Today, I think this week, which was last week, they talk about the so-called African Continental Free Trade Area, for example. And the bourgeoisie made a lot of noise about it. Finally, Africans coming together. We just want to dispel that myth straight away. Those Negroes in power, those thieves in power, they will not unify Africa. The Ramaphosa, the Kagame, and Museveni, all these criminals, they will not unify Africa because African unification of Africa is a revolutionary question. Imperialism will not leave Africa because some Negroes made together, they just decide to create African Continental Free Trade Area. It will not happen like that. It's going to be a revolution. We're going to have to kick imperialists out of our lives, out of Africa, everywhere we are. And also we have to kick out of power the African petty bourgeoisie itself. So people should know dream about these African continental free trade. Everywhere we should call for revolution. We should call for the African Socialist International to be built, to be established in those places. The only legitimate process is the process of unifying Africa through revolution under the leadership of the African working class, led by the African People Socialist Party, everywhere black people are. And that's really critical. And if I may, I just want to read something quickly from One Africa, One Nation, the chapter that says key African identity is key, because I just want people to see, to really appreciate the value of German leadership. This was written in 2005. That's 14 years. It was in July 2005. So 14 years, and we can see everything in this chapter is so clear and is so correct, and is what basically African people should fight for. And I take one example is usually around the question of language. People always come to you and say, "What? You want to unify Africa? All these languages, in Nigeria we've got 400, in the Congo another 400. It won't work." No, it doesn't work like that. So here, basically on the page 90, on a second paragraph, I want to start, let's start from the first paragraph. Page 90, economic unity, key to common language. In terms of this question of nationality, I believe that certain aspects of what Stalin said are correct. I believe language will be a factor in the consolidation of our nationality. Africans talk about this all the time. They say, we speak so many languages. How are we going to unite? Nkrumah suggested that we need to create Afrohili, a combination of Swahili and other languages. The